They're one of the most successful bands ever, changing the landscape of music, fashion, and culture from their humble beginnings in Liverpool, England, until their breakup in the late 60s. Their influence on and in Chicago is indelible. Today we're talking with an author who knows the story inside and out, and he's going to share some of it with us. I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. For a slightly condensed audio-only version of this interview, go to any podcast provider and search for Chicago History Podcast. There are also many other stories about Chicago posted there for you to enjoy. With me today is John F. Lyons. He is the author of the new book, Joy and Fear, the Beatles, Chicago, and the 1960s. Welcome, John.
Well, hello, Tommy. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. Let's get a little background on John F. Lyons. Based on your accent, I'm hearing New Jersey.
Yeah, a little bit further east.
Okay.
But,
okay.
As your listeners probably already guess, I'm not from Chicago, but I'm originally from London, England, and I have a very sort of strange sort of route to this book. So I'll just briefly tell you, I left school at 16. And I was working in construction for 12 years as a welder. And I didn't go to college till I was 28. I went to university. And I went to university in the north of England, in Manchester. And they had a exchange program with Detroit. So I ended up going to Detroit for a year to study. And in one of my classes, actually, to make it even more romantic, in my Vietnam War history class, I met my future wife.
That's very nice.
I know. I thought you'd want to start with a bit of romance.
Yeah, I like that. I like that.
We got together, and I went back to England to finish off my degree, and then we both decided to move to Chicago. And I came to Chicago in 1994 to do my PhD in American history at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And then I stayed in Chicago, and I still live in Chicago today. And I teach in Joliet Junior College, and I teach classes in American and British history. And this is my fifth book. Yeah, you want to know the romantic ending to the story?
I do.
And it is, we're still married, and we hope to be married until the day we die.
So, the funny thing about this book is I grew up a Beatles fan. I felt like I knew a lot about the Beatles. My kids are Beatles fans, so many Beatles fans around me. And yet reading your book blew my mind because there was so much that I didn't know. And being a big fan of Chicago history, of course, there was a ton of stuff to go over as well. One of the great stories that, if I can use a little bit of your stuff, you wrote in your book, Tommy Rowe, who's an American singer who had been touring with the Beatles in the UK, returned to the States with a copy of Please Please Me, played it for his record label, ABC Paramount. The executives have one listen. The president of the company, Samuel Clark, throws the record in the trash can and says, "Gentlemen, that was crap." That to me seems like one of those things that he probably never lived down, right?
He did slightly regret that for the rest of his life. But I think you've got to realize, though, that really no British group or no British artist had really made it in America before the Beatles. You had the odd one-hit wonder. And just before the Beatles came over, you had Cliff Richard, who was the big British hope, came to America, and he died a death. So basically, all of these executives, when they heard that the Beatles were a British group, they just thought that nobody's going to be interested in this. This is not the music that the American market is drawn to. And so I think they already had that prejudice in their minds as soon as they started listening to it. And so it's no coincidence that the Beatles were signed in England to EMI Records. and their subsidiary in America was Capitol Records. And the same thing happened when EMI sent over in early 1963 the Beatles singles that were being released in England, Love Me Do, Please Please Me. The Capitol Records decided that they wouldn't release them because they just didn't think that there was a market for British groups in America. So that's why it ended up with the first record label to release Beatles records in America was actually VJ Records, which was based in Chicago. They not only released the first Beatles single, Please Please Me, in February 1963, but also the first Beatles album in January 1964, and that was Introducing the Beatles.
So John, I happen to have a copy of the VJ. I'm not sure if I'm showing up on camera all that well. Because here we go. Oh, there we go. Copy of the VJ record, which I've had since I was a kid, and I remember thinking, and I do love the back, by the way. I'm not sure if you can see it. There's no UPC. There's no way to really kind of long before UPCs, when they just had a simple little code here, to let people know. Tell us a little bit about VJ Records.
Well, VJ Records was actually owned by African Americans. It was owned by Vivian Carter and her husband, James Bracken. And they were quite a prominent record label before they picked up on the Beatles. A number of Chicago acts, blues acts, soul acts were assigned for VJ. They were based down in Michigan Avenue, South Michigan Avenue, and the building is still there. So if you're ever interested in going down to, if I remember right, the address is 1449 South Michigan Avenue. You can actually see the building there, which is obviously empty now, but it's amazing that it's still there. So anyway, that was a record label that was relatively successful before the Beatles joined the label. But they were offered it because Capitol Records wouldn't release their records. And so it was offered to VJ, and VJ said, we'll give it a go. And they released Please Please Me early February 1963, and they spelt the name of the band wrong. If you look at the record label, you can see
the one that I have obviously had been corrected by them. And again, I don't know how this all came about, that I've had this for so many years. Again, interesting thing about your book is, because they were signed to VJ Records, there was a lot of confusion as to whether they were a white group or a black group at the time. And then the Chicago Defender. Tell us a little bit about the Chicago Defender's involvement in the Beatles.
Yeah. When the VJ released the records, we think that we're virtually sure that the first radio station in America to play Please Please Me, the first single, was WLS, the top 40 juggernaut in Chicago. But then they released a second single from Me to You, and that one was not played on WLS because the first one did so badly. But it was definitely picked up by a number of local African-American radio stations. And we know that because a lot of people actually remember hearing the Beatles and there's also some surveys that are still in existence where you can actually see the Beatles in the top 40 surveys. So they certainly did play in the summer of 63. And but again, that got nowhere either. From Me to You sort of died a death as well. So anyway, but when they got to 64, when the Beatles broke in America, that's when VJ released the Introducing the Beatles album. And it was picked up by everybody in Chicago and elsewhere in 64, pretty obviously. They appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in February 64. But they were also picked up by the Chicago Defender. And, again, you don't really see that much really about the African-American view of the Beatles. But as far as I could see, they were very popular in the South Side and West Side of Chicago, pretty much as they were in the rest of Chicago. Yeah. And of course, the Defender being the major, African-American newspaper in Chicago, if you leaf through that, you can see coverage of the Beatles that is very similar to the coverage they were getting in the Tribune. And they were even running contests And there was a lovely contest where they ran when A Hard Day's Night came out in August 1964, where the Defender was offering tickets to the show in a contest. And of course, they showed then the photograph of the people coming out of the movie theater after seeing it. And of course, every single person was African American. So it gives you an idea that they were picked up by African Americans as well. And certainly the Chicago Defender, which was also critical of them, just like every other newspaper was. But the coverage they gave them certainly did highlight the Beatles and helped them get some kind of coverage in the African American community.
Beatlemania was in such a huge swing. Your description of the loop and how every store had plastic Beatle wigs and pins, and they were giving away licenses for anything to get the Beatles on it. It sounds like Brian Epstein was just like, anybody who came to him with an idea, he'd say, okay, go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
The backlash that happened so quickly, again, was something that I didn't know a lot about. So talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, again, obviously, when the Beatles broke through in America, really, it was January 64. That was when I Want to Hold Your Hand became a #1 record. And then they were on the Ed Sullivan Show on February the 9th, and that brought them to an even bigger audience. So they broke through really early 64. Okay. And, obviously, we've got an impression now that everybody loved the Beatles. Today they're just, they're everywhere, aren't they? You can't find a person that wouldn't say they don't love the Beatles. But in 64, they certainly divided opinion. And a lot of people saw them as this wonderful, joyous, happy experience that give them so much joy in their lives. But a lot of people were worried about the Beatles because America was already changing in the early 60s. There was the civil rights movement was obviously happening. More women were going to work and they were getting equal pay. There just seemed to be a lot of changes where the nation was moving in a certain direction. And some people found this a bit worrying. And they saw the Beatles as kind of like another symbol of this changing America. And the ones I'm thinking about here is the church, the Catholic Church, which was a dominant institution in Chicago, was worried about the Beatles and certainly worried about the female reaction to them, which seemed less than holy. And then the Chicago Tribune, that was the editor at that time, W.D. Maxwell, no great fan. He wrote about them very early on. And the first editorial he wrote about them was warning America that they were coming. And his wonderful second editorial about them, just after they were on the Ed Sullivan Show, was headlined "Human Sheepdogs." So it kind of gives you an idea of where Maxwell and the Tribune were on the Beatles. And then obviously Mayor Daley. Now, Mayor Daley was more interested in the Chicago White Sox and a traditional Irish tune than he was in popular music. But he had to cope, or he had to face the problem, because in September 1964, the Beatles came to his city.
The Beatles come to the International Amphitheater, September 1964, a 13,000 seat arena, which, again, until reading your book, I didn't know that they had considered White Sox Park, Comiskey Park, and decided to go with the amphitheater. Yeah. Was that a daily thing, or was that promoters that were maybe a little bit in over their head, or how did...
The promoter of all the Beatles concerts in Chicago, and they also did the Milwaukee 64 one, was Triangle Productions. And that was owned at the time by somebody called Frank Freed, whose background was as a steel worker, who was heavily involved in left-wing politics, and who really favored folk music. So he had very little interest in pop music, but he was given the concert and he put it on, as his professional duty. And he was offered then White Sox Park. And he decided that that was at the time holding about 40,000 people, far too big. So he put them on instead at the 13,000 amphitheater for one show. And of course, the tickets sold out in a few minutes. He got 50,000 applications for tickets. He asked the Beatles to put on another show, and it was too late, I'm afraid. the horse had bolted. And so they ended up only playing one show on September the 5th in Chicago. But they did come back the following year, and they played 2 shows at White Sox Park. So by that time, they realized the potential of the Beatles. But in '64, they really didn't.
Well, and I loved, more stuff that I didn't know. Leading up to the show at the amphitheater, 4 days before, police found a teenage girl hiding in the press box with enough food to last until showtime. And barbed wire was put up around the entrances, and pipes were greased so that people couldn't try to find a way into the amphitheater before the show. I just thought that was bonkers. I mean,
like a war. It was like an invading army.
Yeah.
And I think, honestly, that's the way that Mayor Daley saw the Beatles. It was like an invasion. When they came here, that was, again, the civil rights movement was active in the city. There was, you probably remember the school boycotts from '63 early.
Of course.
Yeah. There was racially tinged violence in Dixmoor, the suburb. And so, he was already worried. And of course, then he started reading about the reaction the Beatles were getting in the other cities before they came to Chicago.
Right.
Every day he picked up a newspaper and there was riots or there was disturbances in other cities. And this made him even more worried. So by the time we get to September the 5th, Mayor Daley is in a panic.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, though, because, again, other cities, people kind of went out of their way, and, mayors' wives and kids, wanted to meet the Beatles. And even Daley and his press guy, I forget his name, both of them were kind of poo-pooing the idea of the Beatles, but yet were more than happy to ask for tickets. Daley's kids were, he had teenage kids at the time who wanted to go with friends. So I think he asked for 25 tickets. His right-hand man asked for 15 tickets. So they weren't super excited about having the Beatles in town, but if they were going to be in town, they were certainly going to take advantage of their clout to get their kids in to see the show.
Very true.
The '64 show, 35 minutes, no encore, lights come up. These days, people would be breaking chairs, and yet, in your book, it sounds like everybody was thrilled that they were there and loved the experience and walked away saying, this is something I'll remember for the rest of my life, which I'm sure they did,
That's right. Yeah, I mean, the concerts, just to give you an idea, like you said, they barely lasted for about half an hour. And then there was no lighting like you get a show now. There'd be just like a floodlight on the group. And there was no modern day sound system. They were basically no monitors, if you're familiar with them, how they can hear themselves on stage. Most of the instruments were not microphoned properly. So the sound would have been awful. The lighting, there was no lighting show. And of course, you then had 13,000 people, 90% of them girls, and 99% of them screaming.
Yeah.
So that would have been the Beatles' experience in 1964.
Well, right. So your book talked about, Ringo couldn't hear a thing, and I play drums, and it can be tricky, and so he would basically watch the sway of John and Paul to kind of know where the beat was while they were playing. Musician friends of mine have often said the Beatles would play those shows with the same amount of gear that most people would play at an outdoor festival, like a small outdoor neighborhood festival these days. Like, even if everybody was pin drop quiet, you wouldn't have been able to hear them in the far reaches of some of those venues. So,
I think even was the following year when they played at White Sox Park, obviously an open air arena.
Yeah.
And they were right in the middle. They were kind of like it was like a platform they were playing on. And there they were using the same sound system that the White Sox announcers were using. So you can give you an idea. I mean, it must have been literally, you couldn't hear nothing in '65. '64, at least you were indoors and the sound was more sort of enclosed. But again, people that toured with them, they used to have their own journalists traveling with them. And they said that when they got to Chicago, it was the loudest they'd ever heard the audience on the tour. And the other thing about that concert, let me just say one last thing, because it is memorable for. And that is in 1964. By that time, wherever they played, girls used to throw things on stage. And the ones at the front would throw on notes with their phone numbers on them. Don't know how that worked out. They would also throw jelly beans, because they thought that George Harrison had once said that he liked jelly beans. So they decided, oh, that's a good idea, let's throw them at him on stage. So they used to shower them with jelly beans and also cuddly toys. But Chicago 65 or 64, sorry, outdid all of this because somebody threw a steak on stage.
I read that in your book and was a little dumbfounded, I guess, because I was thinking, there was a lot of talk about how, they were skinny, right? They were, definitely skinny, and they had the long hair. And, there were a lot of comments about how the moms thought that they probably, needed a good meal. But the idea of throwing a steak, I didn't get it. And it made me laugh when I read it.
But Tommy, it wasn't cooked, it was raw.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know what
if they threw a cooked steak on stage, I hope they'd eat it. But so anyway, and then of course, then also somebody threw a plaster hand. Again, I don't. Who goes to a concert with a raw steak under their arm or a plastic arm? I don't know. But anyway, that's what made that concert so funny. But anyway, the other thing about the concert was because Mayor Daley didn't want them in town, they arrived in Chicago at about 4:30 at Midway Airport, not O'Hare, because he wanted to put off the fans, so he changed airports. And then he wanted them out of the city as quick as possible. So they never stayed overnight. Even though the concert was an evening concert, they went straight back to the airport and flew on to Detroit at 11:30 at night. They were in Chicago for 7 hours.
It seems crazy. I, again, read in your book that people were booking hotel rooms at all the different hotels, thinking once they figured out where the Beatles were, they might get a chance to bump into them. But of course, that didn't work out so well.
In 65, they stayed out near O'Hare, and no longer there, but the Sahara Inn Hotel, and they announced about a month before the Beatles came that the Beatles were going to stay there. So, of course, all the rooms were booked up by teenagers. So they said that when the Beatles arrived in August 65 at the Sahara Inn, the whole hotel was taken over by teenage girls. So you can imagine what that was like for 2 days. They said it was like some kind of student dormitory or, just incredible that. So that the 65 concert experience was a lot different than 64. In 64, they were in, they were out. But in 65, they did stay for 2 nights.
There was a great thing that I found about the 64 concert. In the Tribune article written about the first Beatles show, one mother was overheard saying, "I feel sorry for them." Another mother then asked, "Who do you mean, the Beatles or the girls?" To which the first mother replied, "The Beatles. What will happen to them when all this adulation has passed them by?" And I thought, boy, much like Samuel Clarke saying like, these guys will never make it. The idea that everybody thought that this was a fad that was going to pass over quickly. I mean, granted, we don't talk about the Beatles, and there isn't an Englishman living in Chicago writing a book about it these days. But
it's just because everybody thought that sort of pop music was something that was a flash in the pan. That was, you'd get your hits. If you're lucky, you make a film and then you just disappear or go into some sort of like showbiz or something. So it was so unusual for these bands to, and of course the Rolling Stones, incredible. They're still playing today, But in 64, the person who was in charge of the concert for the city was Jack Riley. And again, he was a elderly gentleman who was no fan of the Beatles. And they had fans used to write to him and to the mayor asking for tickets or asking to meet the Beatles. And he wrote back to a number of them saying, this band that you want to see in concert, they're going to come into the city, they're going to play, and then they're going to disappear, and you'll never hear from them ever again. So he obviously thought that was the end of them. They'd peaked at this one concert in 64. And of course, much to his surprise, they actually came back in 65 and played to White Sox Park 2 concerts to over 60,000 people. So, but yeah, a lot of people were wrong about the Beatles, obviously.
I don't want to give away too much of your book. I'm impressed on so many levels that it's not just Beatles focus. You talk about the political climate in Chicago. You talk about race issues in Chicago. You talk about so many things that I guess a lot of Beatles fans probably don't consider when thinking about the Beatles in the 60s, and, press conferences and having to apologize for Lennon statements and all that. And thank you for covering all that. Let me ask you, what are a few misconceptions or, things that have been stated over the years that are not true according to your research?
Well, the thing about the Beatles, there's been so many books written about them. And obviously people just, when they write a new book, they pick up on what's been written about them before. And we've all done it. There's probably in my book, there's probably a mistake. Everybody makes the odd mistake because you have to build on what's already been written. But
Right.
It's pretty clear that in terms of the Chicago concerts, that there is a few myths that keep getting repeated. And one of them is in '64. There's this idea that the city was actually putting on a civic reception for the Beatles. Now, Mayor Daley is not putting on any civic reception for the Beatles. So this is absolute nonsense, but it gets repeated over and over. And then in '65, there's another myth that the hotel, and again, it kind of fits in with the Chicago narrative, that the hotel where the Beatles stayed, the Sahara Inn, was owned by gangsters. And again, it wasn't. It was built by a gangster, but he'd sold the hotel to a nice couple from Thornton, far away from being gangsters as you'd ever want to be. So, things like that is sort of like myths. Then there's another one that I'm 50-50 about this story, and that's the one about them visiting Margie's. Now, for those that don't know, Margie's is an ice cream parlor on Western Avenue and Armitage. And the story is that after the concert in '65, the Beatles and a few girls turned up at the Margie's, and they, ate their wonderful ice creams and whatever. And, again, were they ever there? The owner said they were. In my book, I found one or two people that said that they remember it. But then other people are skeptical, including me, because the owner didn't actually say this until the late 1980s. It doesn't appear anywhere in the 1960s. There was none of the people that followed the Beatles around mention them going off to have an ice cream. And also the memorabilia. I don't know, have you been to Margie's?
I have, and I remember, I don't think I looked at it too closely, but there's a picture of the Beatles over one of the booths. But I guess I never looked at it so closely because I just assumed, why would they lie? But obviously I know
memorabilia. But if you actually look at them closely, they're all memorabilia that's been put in there more recently. They're not actually, So again, there's no photos of them in Margie's. There's no.
So it's got them sitting in the booth above the booth
again,
picture.
this is just what we're getting from the owner, who's now dead as well. But so again, I'm not saying it never happened, but it's just I'd rather if there was some evidence actually from the '60s, or at least some photos or autographs, but there isn't. So them sort of thing, you kind of get stories, whether it's true or not. In that case, I'm not 100% sure either way, but they could have been there, but I'd wish there was more evidence for it.
Yeah, I run into the same thing when I'm researching different things, where I think, I can often see where a notion starts, and then I can see other newspapers who pick up the same thing and repeat it. And I go, I can't trace the source cleanly enough where I feel confident in it. So biggest surprise while researching this book, was there anything where you were just shocked?
Well, I think, the thing about the Beatles, again, we have an image of the Beatles as sort of like the mop top Beatles, and cuddly, and Ringo Starr saying peace and love, and Paul McCartney being the sort of like national institution and the vegetarian. Now, in the 1960s, the Beatles changed dramatically. That was one of the things that I find so admirable about them, is that their views about the world around them changed dramatically. And by the late '60s, I was kind of a little bit surprised, because I never read that much about it, that they did embrace extremely countercultural views.
Hmm.
In other words, they weren't just against the Vietnam War, they were pacifists who were very critical of even Britain in World War II and things that people would have taken for granted. They obviously, we do know they took drugs. Now, at the time, we probably didn't know as much as we do now, but they did, and they took hallucinatory drugs as well. And some of their music certainly was influenced by it. Their lyrics were, the names of the songs were. They were also promiscuous, you know, much more than people, again, in the public eye were at the time. And again, we know more about that now, but at the time we even knew that they were promiscuous. They also adopted Indian philosophical beliefs that most people, again, you know, would just never have heard of. This is just incredible. And they became advocates of yoga and also of transcendental meditation. Now, most people in the 60s would have thought that was some kind of like medical complaint that you got, but it's actually from Indian philosophical beliefs. And so anyway, the point I'm trying to get is that I was kind of a little bit surprised about that. And then, of course, the other thing I was surprised about is the reaction from the city of Chicago, you know, towards the Beatles in the late 60s. And the Beatles were attacked because of these countercultural views. You know, WLS refused to play two of their songs and one of John Lennon's solo songs. The city prosecuted people who had shown pictures of John Lennon's Two Virgins album cover. Are you familiar with that one, Tommy? Is that in your collection?
Sure, of course. Yeah.
Have you got the bag over it, or do you?
I don't actually have it in my collection, but you know, I've seen that, and you know, the Butcher album and all the kind of you know, albums that have changed over the years or were deemed too raunchy.
Yeah. So basically, you know, that was the kind of thing that surprised me, as well as all the sort of stories about, you know, I didn't really know that much about that they met the Beach Boys in Chicago in '66, and it kind of shocked me that it was the Beach Boys who wanted to stay up all night partying, and the Beatles wanted to go to bed.
Yeah.
Tell me, I'm shocked. I thought the Beach Boys were these good California lads.
Sure, clean cut, you know, surf in the morning and
short hair. I was wrong. So then just suddenly, I mean, I wanted the book to be full of stories because I wanted to get it from the fan point of view. So again, many stories about people who met the Beatles, some about people who went to the press conferences, a story about one girl who was 14 who got a press pass to actually see the Beatles and go to the press conference. Another girl who went to the bathroom before the Beatles came on at the International Amphitheater, got lost and ended up backstage. So, you know, these are the sort of stories that I kind of like about the fan perspective on the Beatles.
And I don't remember whether you covered it in your book, but, you know, one of those enduring, you know, myths or things said about the Beatles was girls would get so excited and wouldn't want to leave their seats or miss any part of the show that the smell of urine would kind of waft through the auditorium because people would basically just stay and wet themselves instead of missing any part of the show. Any truth to that?
Oh, I think the thing about the girls and the Beatles, in some ways, I think the girls are kind of seen as being silly. And so you've had a lot of coverage about girls, about them being uncontrollable, you know, which is where that idea comes from, that they couldn't control their bladders or they're uncontrollably screaming or whatever. I think actually that's exaggerated. I'm not saying screaming didn't take place, but I actually think the screaming was more like if you go to a sporting event, which is mostly male, and the males cheer. Or if you go to a you know, a classical concert or something, at the end of the movement, people applaud. And I think that's how girls kind of saw screaming in the 60s. I'm not saying that some of them weren't obviously highly attracted and emotional because they saw the Beatles, but also I think a lot of them, it was kind of just like it was taken for granted that if you like the Beatles, you scream. So I think, in other words, these stories about the sort of like, you know, floods of urine and all that, I'm not too, you know, I don't necessarily think
buying into it. Yeah.
I don't necessarily. into that. But
another funny thing you included in your book was Hard Day's Night. People going to Hard Day's Night screaming during the movie where people couldn't hear any of the words.
unbelievable.
I just don't get that, right? Like,
And again, just one. I mean, I interviewed a few people that went to see them the in downtown Chicago in the Loop, but also people that saw them out in the suburbs or whatever, a few days later. And they said they went in, and if you remember the film, it starts with them the note from the song, and then they start running. People said that they remember the first note and nothing else.
Wow.
It was complete screaming for the and now they know how good the film is, because obviously the film is very much about the dialogue. But screaming at the film. And again, I think it was because it was kind of like a space where they could do this. They were allowed to do it by the people owning the cinemas, and their parents allowed them to do it.
Right.
So how many parents were quite happy that their children would spend their money on Beatles records, Beatles memorabilia, and going to the concerts, and even parents putting on parties for their kids, Beatles parties.
Well, again, I found a lot of interesting stuff in the book, and I hope everyone listening will check it out. I'll have a link in the show's notes for people to click through and buy a copy for themselves. Joy and Fear, the Beatles, Chicago, and the 1960s. My guest today, John F. Lyons. I could talk to you for hours about this, but I want to say sincerely, thank you for giving me your time. This has been wonderful.
Well, thank you, Tommy. It was a pleasure to speak to you, and hopefully we'll meet again.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode about the new book, Joy and Fear, the Beatles, Chicago, and the 1960s, written by John F. Lyons. If you'd like to order a copy of the book, support a local author, and help the show, please click on the link in the show's notes to order it. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions about anything covered today or anything to add. My email is chicagohistorypod@gmail.com. I will have plenty of additional pictures related to this story on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Check it out and give us a follow. The Chicago History Podcast logo and the art used on the social media pages was created by John K. Schneider. Thanks, Johnny. It can be found at Angel Eyes Art JKS on Instagram or via email at angeleyesartjks@gmail.com. We'll be back next week with another chapter in Chicago's history. Until then, order a copy of Joy and Fear, the Beatles, Chicago, and the 1960s. While you're waiting for it to arrive, get out and explore when possible. Learn more about whatever city you live in, and stay safe.